Okay, thanks for coming. So this paper is asking the question, how much do leaders explain growth? And it's going to be an exercise in growth accounting, and it's a paper with joint with Bill Easterly. So one key aspect of the story of national development that we've been talking about in this conference is the importance of national leaders. So this is often known in the literature as a sort of great man view of economic development. So by this view, countries that are fortunate enough to have sort of visionary leaders will grow fast. So these are leaders that are viewed to be able to get things done, to sort of jump the hurdles of development, to lead to strong economic growth. And often you can identify these leaders are identified in the sort of public debate as those leaders that have had a high average growth rate during their tenure. So I've listed a few examples here. So Deng Xiaoping of China, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Park Chung-hee in South Korea, and more recently Paul Kagame in Rwanda. So all of these leaders had high average growth rates during their tenure. One other interesting point about all of these leaders is that they have they're part of an autocratic political system, and but the fact that they have had very high levels of economic growth during their tenure has led a number of people to label these leaders as benevolent autocrats. And so, if these countries who have these leaders can experience high rates of economic growth, it sort of raises the question: well, why do we sort of need all the messiness of democratic processes when what we really need is one of these guys to come in and just get the job done? So in the paper, we're going to be looking at the effect of leaders on growth. In particular, we're going to be trying to estimate the variation in this leader effect. So the idea is that if leaders are important for growth and there's sort of going to be variation in the quality of leaders, that should line up with variations in growth rates. So this idea that leadership and growth are connected is pretty common in a lot of policy-making circles. So one area where you could see it quite recently is in the discussion of growth following the financial crisis. So some countries grew faster during the financial crisis than others, and China was one of the ones that came out relatively strongly. And so Birdsall and Fukuyama in this quote, and this is them sort of summarising the public views rather than their own views in particular, have suggested that China's tightly managed top-down policy-making machine could avoid the delays of a messy democratic process in getting sort of the stimulus needed to keep the economy growing. So the World Bank president also emphasises the importance of leadership or governance and growth. So he says in a speech a few years ago that since 2000, nearly 30 developing countries have grown by 6% or more a year, and some common elements to these countries that have grown continuously are stable governments that pursue prudent economic policies. One of the strongest proponents of this connection is this World Bank Commission, World Bank Connected Commission, the Commission on Growth and Development in 2008, that studied a bunch of 13 countries who'd grown quickly over a long period of about 25 years. And one of the findings of this report is that growth at such a quick pace over such a long period requires strong political leadership. So we've seen that in the policy sphere, there's a connection between between high average rates of growth and sort of a view that this is due to the competence of political leaders. So this idea is sometimes popular in academic circles as well. So it's often, in academic circles, it's often used to explain a sort of stylized fact in economic growth, and that is that growth is more variable under autocracies than it is under democracies. And a popular explanation for this is that there's large autocratic leader effects. So Danny Roderick summarises this argument that living under an authoritarian regime is going to be a riskier gamble than living under a democracy. And the idea here is that if you're living under an autocracy, you could get a good autocrat or you could get a bad autocrat. And that means you're going to get high growth or you're going to get low growth. You could get Lee Kuan Yew and have a growth miracle, or you could get Joseph Mobutu and have a growth disaster. And so the reason people have focused on autocrats in this discussion is that they're seen as having more direct influence on economic growth. So if in a democracy, if the leader wants to do something, he has to talk to the legislature, and maybe his plans will not get implemented. Whereas the idea is that in an autocracy, the leader is going to be much less constrained. If he has a good vision, he can implement that vision. Alternatively, if he has a bad vision, he can also implement that vision. And this is summarised in this quote of Gary Becker that says that visionary leaders in autocratic governments need not heed legislative, judicial, or media constraints. So the most rigorous paper in the academic literature that has looked at this connection between leadership and economic growth is Jones and Olkin in 2005 in the QJE, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And they look at random leader deaths. And the reason they do this is that there's a worry that that when there's slow economic growth or high economic growth, that's going to affect whether the leader is still in power or not. So they want to look at some sort of random measure of leader changes. So in this paper, they look at leader deaths during offices. So for example, when a leader dies in an accident like a plane crash, or whether they die from a heart attack, something unexpected and random. And they find that that this change in leaders does lead to a change in economic growth. And this study has been sort of widely cited. So the thing is that leader deaths in office are actually pretty rare. So in their sample, they only have 57 leader deaths. And so there's a question about whether these results are sort of generalizable to other cases of leadership transitions. And we think that these results are probably not more general. Well, that there's at least questions about whether they're more generalizable. So we think that you need to look at this issue in more detail. So what are we going to do in this paper? So we're going to start with this idea that the average growth rate during a leader's tenure is going to be a reflection of the quality of that leader. This is sort of this popular view. And then we're going to look at the variability of this average growth rate, or as I've indicated in the slide, the standard deviation, SD. And we're going to show that this measure has a large standard deviation, but that standard deviation is going to be biased. So it's not actually going to be a very accurate representation of the true leader effects. And then we're going to have two fixes to this problem. The first one is just a different statistical method, which is going to remove most of this bias. And this is going to more than halve the standard deviation of these leader effects. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to add some other controls. So in particular, country effects and a persistence of an error term. And we're going to find that, at least for, in some cases, this is almost going to lead to a very, very small, almost zero leader standard deviation. So I want to start with just a very simple model, the simplest possible model you can think of economic growth related to leaders. So the first equation says that economic growth during a year let's say it's 5% for a particular country, is going to be due to two components. The first one is the strength of the leader's effect on growth, let's say 1%, plus a random component of growth, which might be, let's say, 4%. So why do we want to add a random component to economic growth? Well, the reason is to capture all those things that are sort of out of the leader's control that vary from year to year. So for example, the terms of trade are going to change. If this country's a commodity exporter, there's going to be measurement error in the data. There might be a war, there might be a change in the oil price, all sorts of things like that. And these are actually very important determinants of year-to-year economic growth rates. So we're not going to focus on the level of economic growth. What we want to do is we want to look at the variability of economic growth. So in equation 2, we have this sort of decomposition that the variance of economic growth is going to be equal to the variance of this leader effect plus the variance of this random component. So the idea is that if leaders are a strong determinant of economic growth, then there's going to be variation in the quality of these leaders, and that's going to be reflected in the variation of economic growth. So you'd expect to see the variation in leader quality line up with the variance of economic growth. The measure we're going to look at is this average growth rate during the leader's tenure. And the problem we're going to face is that the random component of economic growth is going to be very variable, especially in autocracies. And so anybody who's sort of looked at data, particularly for less developed countries, will see sort of just huge changes in economic growth that's just very hard to explain. And this is going to mean that it's going to be very hard to isolate sort of a leader effect, and this average growth rate is going to be biased. So you can think of this as, just sort of think about it in a particular example of how randomness is going to affect an average. So imagine you went to Las Vegas with a couple of friends and you gambled on the roulette wheel. So every time you spin the roulette wheel, if you're betting on a different number on the roulette wheel, one guy is going to win and one guy is going to lose. So either you or your friend is going to be no better at playing roulette than any other. But if you look at who's won money after one spin of the roulette wheel, after two spins of the roulette wheel, on average, one guy is going to be ahead and one guy is going to be behind. And over time, these are only going to even out very slowly. And so it's that you have the same kind of idea when you look at average growth rates over leaders. So imagine you have just 1 year of data and you get a growth rate of 6%. Do you know whether that's due to the leader effect or whether you're just lucky that period? So let's say you have 2 years of data. So maybe, and the average growth rate during that period is 6%. Is that because this is a great leader, or is it just because they happen to find oil in that country? So it's going to be very hard to look at this average growth rate over a leader's tenure and say, oh, that's because this leader is good or this leader is not. So just to sort of hammer this idea, I want to look at a particular thought experiment. So suppose hypothetically, for a minute, there are no true leader effects. So the standard deviation of the leader effect in the previous equation is going to be equal to 0. So leaders have no effect on growth. Just hypothetically imagine. Now, suppose that there's a random component, similar to what we'll measure in the data, which is going to be about 6% variation in growth under autocracies and about 3% under democracies. And that's just because autocracies tend to be poorer countries that have sort of more random growth processes. So there's no true leader effects, but there is random growth. What would happen if we measured the average growth rate during the leader's tenure? How variable would that number be? So this is a graph of how variable that number would be. So in red we have the true leader effect, which we assume to be 0. And then in blue we have the effect of we have the size of the estimated autocratic leader standard deviation when we just take an average over the tenure of the leader. So on the x-axis we have the tenure of the leader. So you can see that if you have a leader of only 1 year tenure, then even though there's no true leader effect, you would estimate a leader effect standard deviation of 6%. And then this is going to decrease over time as you average out all these positive and negative lucky and unlucky draws. So this bias is going to be particularly large for leaders of short tenure. So basically the message is if you have a leader that's only been in office for 2 years or 3 years, or sometimes even longer, the average growth rate during that tenure mostly reflects good or bad luck rather than their quality, the quality necessarily of that leader. It's also going to be larger under autocracies than democracies. And the reason for that is just because this random component is going to be much, much larger. So it's like you're making a much larger bet on the roulette wheel. So the guy that's betting $5 on each spin is going to have much less variable outcomes than the guy who's betting $10 on each spin. So I've now discussed why this idea of measuring the leader effect by the average growth rate during the leader's tenure is kind of are going to be a bad idea. Now we're going to look at some data. So we're going to look at 4 growth data sets. Those people who look at growth data sets, they're going to be from the Penn World Tables 7.1, 6.1, Angus Madison's data set, and also the World Bank's World Development Indicators. We're going to look at a data set of national leaders. The main one is going to be taken from Jones and Olkin, and in the paper we also discuss the Archegos data set of national leaders. So this just says that leader X was in power in country Y in this particular years. So if you look at across all of this data, you have over 100 countries, over 1950 to 2000, and in general you have about 5,000 observations and 800 leaders. So this is a lot of data. And so when we think about leaders, we automatically think of some sort of anecdote. This is our favourite leader, he did well. This is our least favourite leader, he did badly. But with this volume of data, those anecdotes are sort of going to even out. And we're going to look at the general effect across all these leaders. So before we get to the idea of what is actually this variance of the leader effect, we want to just do a much simpler exercise. And that is just look at who are the best leaders in the data set by their average growth rate. So what we do is we look at these four data sets and we say, who are the top 5% of leaders by the average highest growth rate during their tenure. And surprisingly, these 4 data sets are actually going to disagree pretty often. And the reason for that is that growth data is very noisy. Excuse me. So I mentioned a couple of these sort of well-known, supposedly benevolent autocrats on the first slide, such as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, Park Chung-hee of Korea, and Deng Xiaoping. All of these leaders are going to be missing from one data set. I mean, it is true that they're going to just miss out, but the point is that you would expect that leaders of sort of this level of celebrity would be, it would be a clear run thing that they're in the top 5% of leaders. But it's actually not the case, just because the data's going to be very, very noisy. And in fact, if we look at all the top leaders by at least one data set, only 25% of these leaders are going to be in are going to be universally recognized in the top 5% across all data sets. So just before we even get to the sort of the statistical issues, you just need to look at the fact that the data is so noisy that this measure is not robust. So now we're going to move to trying to estimate the effect of this leader effect, this sort of variance decomposition. So at the top, suppose we take this naive average leader standard deviation. So that's the one that I showed you in the graph that is going to be biased. So if we did that, we would find that the standard deviation of the leader effect is going to be about 3.5% of growth. So that's growth rate of 3.5% per year, and for democratic leaders, it's going to be lower. It's going to be 2.5%. But the interesting thing is the high proportion of total growth variation explained by these leaders. So it's going to be something like about a third of the variation in total growth would be explained by the leaders. The problem is that, as I explained a couple of slides ago, a lot of this is just due to the random component that reflects the fact that growth could be high or could be low for random reasons, and so a lot of these leaders are going to be lucky or unlucky. So we're going to use a alternative statistical method to back out this random variation. That we've done some statistical tests and show that it actually works pretty well. It's a method commonly used in random effects for those people who do panel econometrics. And then the third point is the leader standard deviation just here after this adjustment. So you can see that the standard deviation of the leader effect falls hugely after this adjustment. So after this adjustment, we find that only 5 to 12% of the total growth variation in autocratic governments is going to be due to this leader effect. So much, much smaller. And also we find the standard deviation of the random component of growth is going to be twice as large for autocratic countries rather than democratic countries. And the reason for that is just that those countries are going to be poorer and growth is sort of more random in poor countries in general. More variable, I should say. So one of the issues here is that there could be more things that are sort of correlated with growth. So in particular, in the previous model, the only component of growth that didn't change from year to year is going to be the leader component. So the model is going to try and force all sort of persistent variation in growth into this leader component, which is going to lead to an estimate that's going to be too high. So what we do is we have a more complicated model that adds these two extra components in blue. So the first is going to be a country-specific component that reflects, for example, the institutions or the geography of the particular country. And the second one is going to be a persistent random component. So this is going to reflect the fact that, let's say you have an oil price shock in 2000, probably that oil price is still going to be high in 2001 as well. So this random shock is going to last maybe a couple of periods. Whereas the previous model is going to confuse that with a leader effect. And we try this on some sort of manufactured data where we simulate some data and we show that this method actually works pretty well. So this is our main results. So this is the variation of this leader effect in the full model after we've done these two adjustments. The first statistical adjustment and secondly adding these other controls. So we find that for autocratic leaders, this variation is going to be between 0 and 0.7%. So much, much smaller than we previously estimated. And for democratic countries, it's going to be between 1 and 1.3%. So we also do some statistical tests to see if there's evidence that this autocratic leader standard deviation is actually positive at all. Are we confident, statistically speaking, that this is greater than 0? And we actually can't reject that test. So we also find that only 0 to 2% of variation in growth is going to be explained by autocratic leaders. So that means if all the growth, only 2% of that, at most, is going to sort of line up with changes in autocratic leaders. So that's very, very small. And so the findings seem to suggest that autocratic leaders are not going to be actually all that important for growth. So this is sort of a negative of the story we had shown at the start of the talk. So you're probably wondering at the moment, how could national leaders be so unimportant for growth? How can you estimate these leader effects being so small? Does it really even make any sense? Well, there are 3 explanations for why leaders might not have such a big effect on growth. The first one is that no one really knows much how to raise growth, including autocratic leaders. So there's a lot of knowledge problems in raising the growth rate. It's hard to know what works, what doesn't. It's hard to observe that this area in a country needs an extra road, this area in a country has a hospital that's not working. And that's a problem that faces autocratic leaders as much as anybody else. The second point is a principal agent problem in motivating the bureaucracy. So to get a lot of stuff done, you're going to need to motivate the bureaucracy to do what they're supposed to do. The police to enforce the laws, the customs officials to let the right goods through customs, the business inspectors to inspect the businesses correctly, the engineers to build good quality roads, and autocrats or national leaders are going to find that as difficult as anybody else. Finally, is sort of the third point, which I think is probably the most important and reflects a strong, I think a sort of naive view of the way that autocratic leaders work, that autocracies work, and that is that autocratic leaders face strong political constraints on what they can and cannot do. So they're not really sort of an unconstrained free agent who's able to implement their vision for the country. They have a group of supporters that keep them in office, and they need to keep those supporters happy, whether that be, for example, the military or leaders in their particular supporting group, whether that be an ethnic group or a regional group. And if they don't keep those guys happy, then there's going to be disastrous consequences for their leadership. And in fact, one of the good examples is one of the benevolent autocrats from the first slide. Park Chung-hee ended up being assassinated by the head of his own secret security service. So these guys are going to really want to put a lot of energy into trying to make sure that they keep their supporters loyal by sort of handing them out rewards, protecting the monopoly of a key supporter, even if it's going to be bad for growth. And so they're going to be very constrained, and that's going to mean that even if they did have a good vision, it's going to be hard for them to implement. So what have we shown in this paper? First, we've shown this idea that the average growth rate during a leader's tenure is a popular measure of whether that leader is going to be good for growth or bad for growth. So if you have a leader that has a high average growth rate, they're often celebrated as being a visionary leader. If they're an autocrat, they could be called a benevolent autocrat. And then if the average growth rate during that leader's tenure is low, people are going to say, well, look at this guy, he's a very bad leader. We're going to show we showed that the variability of this average growth rate is going to be biased due to the random component of economic growth, which sort of evens out only very slowly. And so leaders, and we're going to implement two fixes: a new statistical measure and also adding country and country effects and persistence of the random error term, which is going to reduce these biases. Once we do that, we find very little evidence of an autocratic leader effect. And this sort of suggests that sort of individual autocrats may not be that much in control of, high levels of growth or low levels of growth. And then the final conclusion of this, sort of in the policy debate, is we should beware of attributing high growth to good leadership, or alternatively, low levels of growth to bad leadership. Just looking at the growth and the leader. And this is especially true in autocratic countries because the variation in economic growth is going to be very high. So the random variation and the mismeasurement of economic growth is going to be very high. And it's also going to be particularly true for leaders who have a particularly short tenure, because the random component is going to be much more powerful when in leaders that have short tenure. So that's it. Any questions?
I have a question. Question. Don Reed is my name. I'm from the Caribbean. And the conference is entitled Pioneering Studies in How Development Spreads. Agreed, development does spread. My statement is that not only development spreads, but other things spread as well. That said, how can we allow the development to keep spreading, but at the same time, what do you recommend are some of the filters that we can establish to prevent the opposite of development spreading, which is the R word, recession? We don't want a recession. We want the good, but we don't want the bad. That's my question.
It's kind of a very hard question to answer, and I think one of the lessons of this conference and sort of this line of research is that there's sort of a lot of this stuff is very difficult to know, and we need to take a broader perspective than just looking at particular countries. I don't know if other commentators want to add to that.
Hey,
Yeah.
Stephen. Two questions, more directly related to the methodology you guys used. The first one is, what if it takes some time for a leader to have an impact, right? So I could imagine that maybe the first 1 or 2 years that a new leader comes into power, looking at the growth rates in those years, you may not necessarily should be attributing them to the leader that's currently in power. And on the other side, I mean, you could imagine that a leader effect could persist into a following regime, and how you guys thought about that kind of issue. And then the second question was, I might have misunderstood the model, but I think the idea was that you're assuming that a leader effect and a random component to growth are independent from one another.
Yes, that's right.
And whether there are actually endogeneity issues to consider. So, I mean, leaders can respond to random shocks that would affect growth.
Yeah, so on your second point, first on the endogeneity issue. So this is always a tricky one, but we view this as sort of a variance decomposition. So we don't have sort of a rigorous randomized trial of changing leaders and then seeing what would happen to growth. So we sort of see this as a variance decomposition, but the way we rationalize that view is that you would expect that if leaders did have a strong effect on growth, you expect sort of the timing of these changes to line up. So it's so we don't sort of see this as a view, or as a sort of causal view from a change in leader to a change in growth, more that if that were the case, you would expect these two to changes in leadership and changes in growth to line up, and we don't really see that in the data. And on your second point about the lagged effect, so this is definitely an issue. So we follow Jones and Olkin, and and assume that the bulk of the effects are contemporaneous. So the main reason for doing that is just tractability, that if you assume that the leader could have an effect over the next 25 years, it's going to be very hard to pin down the effect of one leader versus another. So we have to make that assumption that the bulk of a leader's effects, the bulk of the effect of the leader is going to be in the short term. And I think when you look at the policy discussion, that's sort of what policymakers are discussing. So they're not discussing that. So they're observing a leader in office, and they're seeing high levels of growth, and they're saying, "Oh, this is a good leader. He's leading to high levels of growth." They're not sort of commenting on 5 years down the track, 10 years down the track. Yeah.
Yes, outside of the special interest groups like, for instance, the Army and the elitist group, did you observe the impact of the general population on effective leaders, for instance, the level of education, health, and consciousness in terms of determining between an effective leader and a non-effective leader?
So, I think that those factors are going to be very important for determining, leader quality. But that's not something we've looked at in this paper, because we're sort of taking a growth accounting variance decomposition rather than sort of like running a growth regression. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely an interesting point. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm just curious, what role do you think external factors play in the importance of leaders? I'll give you an example, right? So Ghana, for example, had Nkrumah as a leader. He started off democratically and then later became like a dictator and stuff. And there are speculations that external factors played a role in overthrowing him, and not just in Ghana, in other places. So what role do you think that these external forces have on the impact that certain leaders have?
So sorry, can you just clarify so what specific external factors you're talking about?
So when say other countries deem that an autocratic leader is not a good person for the country, the police step in covert ways and help overthrow that leader. There are speculations, to some examples. I'm just curious if you think that would have an impact on the performance of certain leaders.
Well, of course it could. That's not really something we look at very much in this paper. But yeah, that might be an interesting area for further work. Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm just asking for a little latitude, but because it's not often that an elder from the hood get a chance to address this illustrious group of young students here, right? Since you're talking about leaders, I had a leader in mind that I would like to present, because all the leaders here run through there. We have had those quality leaders in this country for many centuries. But the leader I'm talking about is one that has gave up his life for us as a people, a great Pan-African leader called Marcus Garvey. And you young people, you can get a copy of the philosophy and the opinions of Marcus Garvey, and it will do you well. I'd just like to read, I'm a quick reader. Mr. Garvey said something, a message to us as Africans, and he also sent that message to the Aborigines of Australia. Mr. Garvey says, education is the medium by which a people are prepared for the creation of their own particular civilization and the advancement and glory of their own race. He goes on to say that you must never stop learning. The world's greatest men and women were people who educated themselves outside of the university with all the knowledge that the university gives. He said one must never stop reading. Read history incessantly until you master it. This means your own national history, the history of the world, social history, industrial history, and the history of the different sciences, but primarily the history of man. Because if you don't know what went on before you came here and what is happening at the time you live, but away from you, you will not know the world and will be ignorant of the world and mankind. He said you can only make the best out of life by knowing and understanding it. And to know, you must fall back on the intelligence of others who came before you and have left their records behind. He said to continue always in the application of the thing you desire educationally, culturally, or otherwise. And never give up until you reach the objective. You say you can reach your objective if others have done so before you, proving by they doing it that it is possible. And you say never, you must always let Africa be our guiding star, our star of destiny, because a people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. That's the kind of leadership that we need in this world, and we don't have any of those around anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.